Hello, everyone. I just want to do a quick video on an issue that I thought might be helpful as you move forward in this course, which is, after all, a course on reasoning, right? So, and arguments. We're approaching this in an informal way through the analysis of texts that contain reasoning and philosophy. We're not doing it with any sort of formal method or anything like that involved. But I thought, a couple things I might point out, things that were helpful to me, I think, as I was studying philosophy and teaching philosophy. Let's look at the structure first of the weekly assignment, which is right here. What is the main conclusion of this text, if there is one? What is the reasoning that leads the author to this conclusion? That's the first part. Right? That's the first part of the assignment, is to identify something like the argument of the text. Is the argument a good one? Why or why not? That's the second part. So the first part is really laying out what you take to be the main argument of the text. Second part is a critical evaluation. But what is an argument? I mean, what do I mean when I refer to an argument? Well, the usage of the word argument in logic is usually that an argument is both the reasoning, and the conclusion, both the conclusion and the support, that they constitute an argument as a whole. I mean, it's perfectly okay just to call the argument the supporting argument, but just so you know that. So when I say identify an argument, really identifying this. I mean, there's got to be a conclusion, and there's got to be reasons offered for that conclusion. And when we begin to be more directly conscious of what we're reading as arguments, the trick becomes to identify in any piece of argumentative writing just what the argument is. And that's not easy, as we know, and sometimes there's not one single argument. But taken at face value, what you're really trying to do here is to what is the reasoning, what is the conclusion, and what is the reasoning that leads the author to the conclusion. Basically, what I'm asking you to do is to identify an argument, and that would mean something that has this structure. And I think people did that quite well. I mean, it was not easy with Russell because it's not completely clear. It's not unambiguous what exactly he's arguing for, different choices. But the reason I was prompted to do this video is really about the second part of the assignment. Is the argument a good one? Why or why not? In which I ask you to evaluate the argument. But what does that mean? It may not be on the face of it really clear what it means to evaluate an argument. But going back to basics, which is, again, what helped me. What is a good argument? On what basis do we say that something's a good argument or a bad argument? Well, just to start again with the basics, what is a good argument? A good argument is one where the reasons actually establish the truth of the conclusion. That's how we evaluate arguments. Do the supporting reasons actually show that the conclusion is true? If they do, then it's a good argument. If they don't, it's a bad argument. So I think that's a huge oversimplification, obviously, of real world arguments and the way that we really evaluate them. But it is the essence of it. And I think something, again, which is quite simple, but helped me to keep that in mind, is that when you're looking at any argument, you can evaluate it. Right? And that evaluation will be a matter of whether the reasons actually support the conclusion, in the sense that establish that the conclusion is true. Now, just to point towards some of our difficulties in the real world, I mean, it's not always so simple. In deductive logic, we have something called a syllogism, which is something with a premise, a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And the most famous one is Sorry, getting in the way here. Now, if we look at this is an argument. This is a syllogistic argument. If we look at it, then we have reasons or really premises here. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The premises here, all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, lead inexorably to the conclusion, in the sense that if the premises are true, if it's true that all men are mortal, and if it's true that Socrates is a man, it's got to be true that Socrates is mortal. That is, it's deductively valid. Now, of course, we can ask a couple of things about arguments. Arguments are said to be valid when the premises actually lead to the conclusion. To put it in loose terms, then that means an argument is valid. But of course, an argument could be valid even if the premises are false. That is, false premises also have implications, right? So then there's another term that's used, which is sound. If an argument has true premises and is valid in its reasoning, it's said to be sound. So I suppose that when I ask you to do this second step, you might say that what I'm asking you to do is to establish whether the argument is a sound one. And a sound argument is one where the reasons that are given for a conclusion are actually true, in the sense that, let's say here, where these premises are true, presumably they seem to be true. They do imply the conclusion, and so we can trust the conclusion. So a good argument is really a sound argument, and that's not so easy to determine in the real world. Arguments like this are simple, but in the real world, the complex arguments, it can be very difficult to determine even what the premises of the argument are, much less to establish whether or not they're true and whether or not they actually do imply the conclusion. But when I ask you in the second part, is the argument a good one? Why or why not? Really what I'm asking, do the reasons given actually establish the truth of the conclusion? And that's not, in most cases, a very easy question. It's a complex question, and it's a matter of judgment. So, we do our best, but it's kind of like the whole point of a critical reasoning class is to get better at assessing arguments. So the second step is a very important part of the weekly assignment. And I think that if I saw one trend in the assignments that I've read, I still want some I haven't read, but I've read most of them. It's that people gave short shrift to this second part, which is the critical evaluation of the argument. And that perfectly understandable, especially dealing with a difficult text. But you don't want to do that. It's really the hardest part is the second part and the most important part in a way. So you want to spend a lot of effort, at least as much effort, in your critical evaluation of the argument as you do in laying out the argument. And just to, again, getting back to basics, maybe pointing out something that's quite obvious, although, again, it was helpful to me. What is a good argument? Well, it's one where the reasons actually establish the truth of the conclusion. And, of course, that may not be a yes or no answer. In deductive logic, it's always formal logic. It's a lot easier to determine whether an argument is a good one. But in the real world, it's not. I mean, sometimes there aren't just good and bad arguments. There are good and better arguments, and there are bad and worse arguments. So, the reasons may not establish the conclusion definitively and for all time and with utmost certainty, but they may make it more likely to be true in our minds. One way we could change this to one where the reasons actually establish the truth of the argument. You could say that a good argument is one where we may have to adjust the standards somewhat to say, to establish the truth of it, period, may be asking too much of the argument in this case. Really, lots of times it depends upon subject matter. I would imagine it's an old observation, goes back to Aristotle, that our standards of proof and they change according to the subject matter. For instance, if we were making a political argument, we wouldn't expect the same degree of rigor if we were making a scientific or mathematical argument. So we may say that, a good argument, at least in some subject areas, is not one where we actually definitively establish the truth of the conclusion, but one where the reasons make it more plausible, more probable, more likely that the conclusion is true. But it's the sort of the same sort of thing where we're evaluating the strength of the reasoning and the degree to which the reasoning actually supports the conclusion. So you want to keep that in mind, and just remember that it's when you identify an argument, you're setting up a possible evaluation of that argument. And the evaluation really is a matter of that. That is, to what degree do the reasons actually support the conclusion.